She was 61 years old, and she had $4 silver and one worn half-dollar left to her name. That was all that remained after the freight company her late husband had built with his own 2 hands was taken from her by men who wore fine suits and never once looked her in the eye. Her name was Clara Whitfield, and by the autumn of 1809, she had nothing left but a carpet-bag, a Bible with her husband's handwriting in the margins, and a debt she did not owe but was told she must pay. The railroad company that had strangled her husband's freight business now owned the papers on everything she once called home. So when she heard that an old, rusted-out railroad boxcar sat forgotten on a dead siding outside a dying town called Miller's Bend, its wheels sunk into weeds, its paint peeling like old skin, she did not laugh the way the men at the depot laughed. She walked 3 miles in the rain to see it for herself. And when the railroad clerk told her she could have the whole rotting hull for $5, just to be rid of it, she reached into her carpet bag and counted out every coin she had left in this world. The men standing nearby shook their heads and called it the foolish decision of a desperate old woman. They did not know that inside the walls of that forgotten car was a secret that had been hidden for 11 years. Secret that would not only save her life, but restore a town that history itself had tried to erase. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield. If you believe forgotten places still hold forgotten stories, tell us in the comments. Clara Whitfield was born in 1828. In a small clapboard house at the edge of a Missouri River town, where the current ran brown and slow, and the cottonwoods grew thick along the banks. Her father was a wheelwright, a quiet man with sawdust always caught in the creases of his knuckles, and her mother took in mending from the wealthier families in town, her fingers moving needle and thread long after the candles had burned low. They were not poor in spirit, though they were poor in coin, and Clara grew up understanding a lesson that would follow her the rest of her days. Her mother used to say that nothing broken was ever truly worthless, only waiting for someone patient enough to see what it could still become. Clara watched her mother take a torn wedding dress, yellowed with age and half-eaten by moths, and turn it into christening gowns for 3 families who could never have afforded new cloth. She watched her father take a wagon wheel that other men had thrown onto the burn pile and turn it, with nothing but a plain and a steady hand, into something that rolled true again. It was not charity in the way townfolk spoke of charity, with pity dressed up as kindness. It was something quieter than that, something her parents never had a name for, but which Clara would later come to understand as respect for what other people had given up on. By the time she was 12, Clara could read ledgers better than boys twice her age who were being groomed for the counting houses back east. And she had a memory for numbers and dates that unsettled some of the neighbor women, who thought such things unbecoming of a girl. Her father did not agree. He taught her how to read the grain of a piece of wood to know if it would hold weight, how to read the wear on an axle to know how many more miles it had left in it, and how to read the eyes of a man across a bargaining table to know whether he was telling the truth about what he was selling. It was said in town, quietly and without unkindness, that Clara Whitfield could look at a busted wagon in a ditch and tell you not only what it was worth, but what it had once been worth, and what it might be worth again if someone cared enough to try. At 19, she married a freight hauler named Thomas Whitfield, a broad-shouldered man with a slow laugh and an honest face, who ran a small but growing line of wagons between the river towns and the new rail depots pushing westward. Thomas did not care that Clara had no dowry to speak of. He said on the evening he proposed to her beneath a stand of sycamore trees, that he had never met a woman who understood the value of things the way she did, and that a man building a business needed a partner who could see worth where others saw only ruin. Together they built the Whitfield freight line from 4 wagons into 22, hauling grain, lumber, mail, and machinery across 3 counties. And Clara kept every ledger herself, her handwriting small and exact, her columns never once out of balance. She learned to negotiate with grain merchants and lumbermen, to read a contract for the traps hidden inside its clauses, and to know, long before most women of her era were permitted to know such things, exactly how a business could be built honestly, and exactly how it could be stolen dishonestly. That knowledge, quiet and hard-earned, would matter more than she could have imagined. For 26 years, the Whitfield freight line prospered, modestly but steadily, the way honest things often do, without fanfare, without excess, simply by being useful to people who needed it. Thomas and Clara never had children of their own, though they took in a niece for a time. And Clara often said that the freight line itself had become something like a child to her, something she had nursed and worried over and watched grow strong. Then, in the spring of 1887, the railroad came through in earnest. And everything Clara Whitfield had spent her whole life building began, slowly and then all at once, to come apart. The Continental Overland Rail Company did not need to destroy the Whitfield freight line through violence or threats. They destroyed it the way powerful companies so often did in that era. Through paperwork, through contracts written in language designed to confuse, through promises made in front of witnesses and quietly broken behind closed doors. A man named Harlan Pruitt, a regional agent for the railroad company, came to Thomas Whitfield with an offer that seemed, on its face, almost too generous to refuse. The railroad wanted exclusive rights to haul freight along the new spur line being built through the county. And in exchange, they offered the Whitfield freight line a contract to service the smaller towns the railroad itself would not bother reaching. Towns too far from the tracks to matter to men who thought only in terms of profit per mile. Thomas signed the contract in good faith, the way honest men often do, trusting that words on paper meant what they appeared to mean. Clara read the contract too, and something in her did not sit right, though she could not, at the time, put her finger on exactly what. 2 years later, Thomas Whitfield died of a fever that swept through the river towns that winter, leaving Clara alone to run the business. And it was only after his death that she discovered the clause buried on the contract's third page, written in language so dense and legal that even careful eyes could slide right past it. The clause stated that should the railroad company at any time determine the smaller routes to be, in their words, no longer commercially viable, the exclusive hauling rights granted to the Whitfield freight line would be revoked. While the debts the company had encouraged Thomas to take on 4 new wagons and warehouse space would remain fully due. Within 8 months of Thomas's death, the railroad declared the smaller routes no longer viable. Clara was left holding notes on warehouses and wagons she could no longer use profitably. Debts that had seemed reasonable when the contract promised steady income and no income left to pay them. She fought as hard as a woman in her position could fight in that era, walking into banks and lawyers' offices where men listened politely and then explained, with the practiced patience of those who have delivered bad news many times before, that a widow with no male relation to stand behind her had very little standing in a court of law against a company as large as the Continental Overland Rail Company. One by one, the wagons were sold at auction to settle the debts. Most of them purchased, cruelly enough, by agents working directly for the very railroad company that had engineered her ruin. The warehouse went next, then the small house she and Thomas had shared for over 2 decades, rooms echoing empty as she packed what little remained into a single carpet bag. By the autumn of 1809, Clara Whitfield, 61 years old, stood at the edge of everything she had built and found there was almost nothing left to stand on. She did not weep in front of others, though she wept alone at night in the boarding house room she rented for 15 cents a week. The last of her savings dwindling with each passing day. She had one skill left that no man could repossess, and no contract could strip away. And that was her eye for value where other people saw only waste. It was that eye sharpened over 61 years of watching her parents restore what others discarded that led her, on a gray October morning, to the dead rail siding outside the fading town of Miller's Bend. Miller's Bend had once been a modest but hopeful town built around a grain depot and a spur line that connected it to the larger rail networks pushing west. But when the Continental Overland Rail Company rerouted its main line 11 years earlier, choosing a path 14 miles to the north where the grades were gentler and the construction cheaper, Miller's Bend had withered like a plant cut off from water. Half its storefronts stood empty, their windows dusty, and their signs faded past reading. And the town's population had dwindled from nearly 900 souls to fewer than 200, most of them too old, too poor, or too stubborn to leave. Where the abandoned spur line curved away from the main track and simply stopped. Sitting on rails half swallowed by prairie grass was a single derelict boxcar, its wood siding gray and split from years of weather, its iron fittings rusted to the color of dried blood. It had been left there, forgotten, when the rail company abandoned the spur. Too much trouble to haul away, not worth enough to bother scrapping properly. Clara had heard about it from the woman who ran the boarding house, who mentioned it only in passing, as an example of the kind of useless junk the railroad company left, scattered across the countryside like careless children abandoning broken toys. Something in the way the woman said it, dismissively, without a second thought, made Clara want to see the car for herself. She walked the 3 miles to Miller's Bend that October morning, the rain coming down in a thin, cold drizzle that soaked through her shawl. And when she reached the siding and saw the old boxcar sitting alone in the wet grass, she did not see junk. She saw good seasoned oak beneath the rot on its surface, timber that would have cost real money to mill fresh. She saw iron fittings that, rusted as they were, could be cleaned and reused. She saw 4 solid wheels and axles that, with some grease and patience, might roll again. And she saw, most of all, 4 walls and a roof, which was more shelter than she currently possessed. Now that her boarding house rent had come due and her coin purse held only what remained after that morning's breakfast. The railroad clerk who managed what little business still passed through the Miller's Bend depot, a tired, thin man named Elias Cobb, told her the truth plainly when she asked about the car. The Continental Overland Rail Company considered the boxcar a total loss, not worth the cost of hauling it away for scrap, and the company had authorized him to sell it to anyone willing to take it off the books, provided they also took responsibility for clearing it from the siding eventually. He named a price of $5 more out of habit than expectation, since he did not truly believe anyone would want it. Clara reached into her carpet bag and counted out for silver dollars and 1 worn $half, every cent she had left in the world, and placed them in his open palm without a moment's hesitation. Elias Cobb blinked at her, clearly startled that she had actually paid, and asked, not unkindly, whether she understood what she was buying. "It's an old railroad car," he said. "It's good for nothing but firewood and rust." Clara only thanked him and asked for the bill of sale. Word traveled fast in a town as small as Miller's Bend, and by that evening more than a few townsfolk had heard that the widow Whitfield, ruined by the very railroad that now sat abandoned in the weeds, had spent her last $5 on a rotting boxcar nobody else wanted. Some laughed behind their hands. Others shook their heads with something closer to pity, murmuring that grief and hardship had clearly addled the poor woman's judgment. Clara paid them no mind. She had learned long ago that the people quickest to call something worthless were rarely the ones who had bothered to look closely at it. She spent that first evening simply walking around the car in the fading light, running her weathered hands along its splintered siding, checking the give of the wood beneath her palm, noting which boards were sound and which had rotted through. The door on the car's side was jammed, swollen shut with years of rain and rust, and it took her the better part of an hour, working with a borrowed iron bar from the depot tool shed, to finally force it open with a groan of protesting metal. Inside, the car was dim and smelled of dust, old grain, and something faintly metallic, like the inside of an old coin purse. Most of the interior was as she expected, an empty save for a rotted grain sack in one corner and a scattering of dead leaves that had blown in through gaps in the siding over the years. But as she ran her hand along the far wall, feeling for soft spots in the wood the way her father had taught her to check a wagon bed for rot, her fingers caught on something unusual. One of the wall boards, near the floor in the car's rear corner, did not sit flush the way the others did. It had been cut, she realized, running her fingertips along the seam in the fading light. Cut deliberately and then fitted back into place, not by weather or age, but by human hands, and hidden well enough that a careless glance would never have noticed it at all. Her heart, tired as it was from the days-long walk and the weight of everything she had lost, quickened just slightly. She did not pry the board loose that evening. The light was failing, and something in her, some old instinct sharpened by decades of reading people and contracts and the wear patterns on wagon wheels, told her that whatever lay behind that board deserved better light and a steadier hand than she could offer at dusk. She latched the door as best she could, walked back to the boarding house in the last gray hour of daylight, and lay awake that night on her thin mattress, listening to the rain against the window, wondering what kind of secret a dying railroad company would bother hiding inside a boxcar it considered worthless. She returned to the siding at first light the next morning, carrying a small pry bar she had borrowed, once again from Elias Cobb, who had grown curious enough about the widow's purchase that he walked out with her, ostensibly to check on company property, though Clara suspected simple curiosity played its part as well. Together they worked the hidden board loose, and beneath it, tucked into a shallow cavity built into the car's wall frame, they found a small oilcloth bundle, tied with waxed string, dry and undisturbed despite the years. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she untied the string, and inside the oilcloth, she found a leather journal, its pages yellowed but legible, along with a folded set of papers bearing an official-looking seal and a small brass key that fit no lock either of them could immediately identify. The journal belonged to a man named Josiah Reed, a surveyor who had worked for the Continental Overland Rail Company 11 years earlier, during the very period when the main line had been rerouted away from Miller's Bend. His handwriting was careful and precise, the hand of a man accustomed to recording measurements and observations exactly as he saw them. And as Clara turned the brittle pages by the gray morning light filtering through the car's open door, she began to understand that Josiah Reed had seen something in 1878 that the railroad company had never wanted anyone else to see. The journal's early entries were mundane, filled with surveying notes, elevation measurements, and observations about soil composition along the proposed rail routes. The ordinary record-keeping of a man simply doing his job. But partway through, the tone shifted, and Josiah Reed began recording something far more troubling. He wrote of a homesteading community established just north of Miller's Bend in the years following the war. A settlement of freed families and poor white farmers together, who had filed legitimate land claims under the Homestead Act and built a modest but thriving community they called Freedom Crossing. According to Reed's careful notes, the original survey he conducted showed that the gentlest, most cost-effective route for the new rail line ran directly through Miller's Bend itself, along the path the town had always expected the railroad to take. The alternate route, the one 14 miles north, was more expensive to grade, required more bridge work across difficult terrain, and offered no meaningful advantage to the railroad company except for one thing: that northern route ran directly through the heart of Freedom Crossing. In the Continental Overland Rail Company, Reed's journal revealed in increasingly troubled entries, had deliberately chosen the more expensive and more difficult route specifically, because company officials wanted the land beneath Freedom Crossing for themselves. Having learned that a vein of valuable limestone, useful for railbed construction across the entire region, ran directly beneath the settlement's fields, rather than purchase the land honestly from the families who held legitimate homestead claims, the railroad had used its influence with regional land officials. Some of them bribed outright, according to Reed's careful and damning notes, to have the Freedom Crossing land claims quietly invalidated on manufactured technicalities, clearing the families off land they had legally earned and worked for over a decade. The families of Freedom Crossing had been scattered, their homes and fields seized, their years of labor erased from any official record, while the railroad extracted limestone from beneath the settlement for years afterward, all while Miller's Bend, the town that should rightfully have received the main line, was left to wither on a rerouted spur. Collateral damage in a scheme that had nothing to do with grades or costs and everything to do with greed dressed up as sound business judgment. Clara sat inside that old boxcar for a long while after reading through the journal's core revelation, the papers trembling slightly in her weathered hands, not from the cold morning air, but from something closer to grief mixed with a slow-building anger she had not felt since the day she signed away the last of Thomas's wagons at auction. She understood now why Josiah Reed had hidden his journal so carefully. A later entry, dated only weeks before the journal's final pages, revealed that Reed had grown increasingly uneasy with what he had documented and had begun quietly gathering additional evidence, including a copy of the original survey maps showing the honest route through Miller's Bend, alongside correspondence between railroad officials discussing the Freedom Crossing land in terms that left no doubt about their intentions. He had hidden the journal and papers inside this very boxcar, one of dozens sitting on a siding he knew would eventually be abandoned once the rerouted line was complete, planning, as his final entry suggested, to eventually bring the evidence to a federal land office or a sympathetic newspaper once he felt it was safe to do so without losing his position or endangering himself. The journal's final entry, dated just 11 days before the car was pulled onto the dead siding at Miller's Bend and left there, reads simply that Reed had been reassigned without explanation to a distant survey crew in the territories, and that he suspected certain company officials had grown suspicious of his inquiries. There was no further entry after that. Elias Cobb, standing beside Clara, in the boxcar's open doorway. Asked quietly what had become of Josiah Reed, and Clara admitted she did not know, though something in her chest ached at the thought of a careful, honest man silenced so completely that his name had vanished from the historical record entirely, remembered by no one until a widow with her last $5 happened to pry open a hidden board in an abandoned car. The folded papers beneath the journal proved just as significant as Reed's written account. They included copies of the original 1878 survey, bearing an official surveyor's seal and Reed's own precise measurements, clearly showing the direct cost-effective route through Miller's Bend that the railroad had rejected, alongside 3 letters exchanged between regional railroad officials, including one from Harlan Pruitt himself, the very agent who had years later engineered the collapse of Clara's own freight business, discussing in coldly practical language the limestone deposits beneath Freedom Crossing and the most efficient way to clear the land of its inconvenient homesteaders. Clara read Harlan Pruitt's name in that letter and felt something settle in her, quiet and resolved. The recognition that the man who had ruined her family's business and the scheme that had destroyed an entire community's home were connected by more than mere coincidence. The small brass key, its purpose still unclear, was wrapped separately in a scrap of paper bearing a single scrawled word in Reed's hand. Overton. Neither Clara nor Elias recognized the name that morning, though it would not remain a mystery for long. Word of Clara's discovery could not be kept entirely quiet in a town as small as Miller's Bend. Though Clara, with the same careful instinct that had once helped her read a bargaining table, chose to share only enough to be useful and no more, keeping the full weight of what the journal revealed close to her chest while she decided how best to proceed. She began asking careful questions around town, and it was old Mrs. Overton, the town's retired schoolteacher, now nearly 80 and living quietly above the shuttered mercantile, who finally provided the missing piece. Mrs. Overton's late husband, it turned out, had once kept the strongbox and land records for the county clerk's office, back before the position was consolidated into the larger county seat 14 miles away, and she remembered, though the memory had grown dim with decades, that her husband had once mentioned a duplicate set of land office records, kept privately rather than filed officially, belonging to a surveyor who had come through town some years back, looking troubled and asking pointed questions about homestead filings. The brass key, Mrs. Overton suggested, after some thought, might well fit her late husband's old strongbox, which she still kept unopened. In the attic of her home, having never found the key to it since his passing 8 years earlier, Clara climbed the narrow attic stairs of the Overton house that same afternoon, her heart beating with a mixture of hope and apprehension, and found the strongbox exactly where Mrs. Overton remembered it, dusty and forgotten beneath a stack of old quilts. The brass key turned smoothly in the lock, as though it had been waiting patiently for 11 years for someone honest enough to come looking. Inside, Clara found duplicate land office records for the original Freedom Crossing homestead claims, filed and certified copies bearing official county seals, proof beyond any dispute that the families of Freedom Crossing had held legitimate legal title to their land at the time the railroad forced them off it. Alongside the records was a short, unfinished letter in Josiah Reed's handwriting, addressed to a federal land commissioner, describing everything he had documented and requesting an official investigation. A letter he had apparently never had the chance to finish or send before his sudden reassignment. Clara now held in her own 2 hands, in a single afternoon inside a dusty attic in a dying town, enough evidence to prove that an entire community had been stolen through fraud, that the railroad company responsible for her own ruin was the very same company responsible for that theft, and that a decade of silence and forgetting could finally be undone if she found the courage and the means to bring it forward. Harlan Pruitt, the man whose name appeared in Reed's letters as the architect of the Freedom Crossing scheme, was no longer merely a regional agent by 1800 and 1809. In the years since ruining the Whitfield freight line, he had risen to become a senior land agent for the entire Continental Overland Rail Company, respected in banking circles, seated on the board of the Regional Development Association, and widely regarded among those who did not know his history as a shrewd and successful businessman who had helped bring prosperity to the region. When word reached him, through channels Clara never fully learned, that an old boxcar sold for scrap out of Miller's Bend had yielded documents relating to Josiah Reed, he did not wait long to act. Within 2 weeks of Clara's discovery, Harlan Pruitt himself arrived in Miller's Bend, arriving by private rail car with 2 company lawyers in tow, and requested a meeting with the widow Whitfield. Framed publicly as a courtesy call to check on a former business associate's family, though Clara understood immediately what it truly was. He was polite in the way powerful men often are when they believe they still hold every advantage. He offered Clara a sum of money, framed generously as compensation for the inconvenience of discovering old company scrap papers, provided she surrendered the documents and the journal, and agreed never to speak of the matter again. The sum he offered, though modest by the standards of a company as large as the Continental Overland Rail Company, was more money than Clara had seen in the 2 years since Thomas's death, more than enough to lift her out of the boarding house and into a comfortable, quiet retirement. She was 61 years old, tired in ways that went beyond the body. And the fight ahead of her, against a company with lawyers and influence and the ear of every banker in 3 counties, seemed at times almost too large to face alone.
Ow.
But then she thought of Josiah Reed, a careful and honest man erased so completely that no one in Miller's Bend even remembered his name until she found it written in his own hand. She thought of the families of Freedom Crossing scattered across the territory, their years of labor and legal claim wiped away as though they had never existed at all. And she thought of her own ledgers, kept honest for 26 years, while other men built fortunes on contracts designed to deceive. Clara Whitfield told Harlan Pruitt, quietly, but without hesitation, that the documents were not hers to sell, because they had never truly belonged to her at all. They belonged, she said, to the people of Freedom Crossing, and to the memory of a surveyor who had tried, in his own quiet way, to do right by them before he vanished from every record that mattered. Harlan Pruitt's polite demeanor cooled considerably at her refusal, and he reminded her with a thin edge beneath his civil tone that a widow with no standing and no resources would find it a very difficult thing indeed to challenge a company as large and well-connected as his. Clara only replied that she had learned, from watching her own life dismantled by careful paperwork and quiet influence, exactly how such companies operated, and that she intended to use that same knowledge against him now. Pruitt left Miller's Bend that same afternoon, but not before making it clear, through channels both direct and indirect, that anyone who assisted the widow Whitfield in pursuing this matter further would find their own business dealings with the railroad, and with banks that depended on the railroad's goodwill, growing considerably more difficult. Several townsfolk who had initially offered to help Clara quietly withdrew their support in the days that followed, unwilling to risk what little livelihood remained to them in a town already gutted by the railroad's earlier abandonment. Elias Cobb, however, did not withdraw, and neither did Mrs. Overton, and slowly. A small handful of others in Miller's Bend, people who remembered what the town had lost when the line was rerouted, began quietly gathering behind Clara's effort, even as the larger fight ahead remained daunting and uncertain. Clara knew that documents alone, however damning, would mean little without someone willing to make them public, and someone with legal standing to press the matter before a court or a federal land office. She spent the following weeks writing letters, in her own careful, exact hand, the very federal land commissioner Josiah Reed had once intended to contact, enclosing copies of the certified homestead records and a full transcription of the relevant journal passages. And she wrote as well to a newspaper editor in the county seat, a man named Buford Lang, known locally for his willingness to print stories that made powerful men uncomfortable. She traveled, using what little money remained from selling a few pieces of jewelry Thomas had once given her, to track down surviving families of Freedom Crossing, scattered as they were across 3 counties and beyond, finding at last a small community of them, living modestly near a river town, nearly 40 miles distant, led by an elder named Amos Freeman, whose father had helped found the original settlement. Amos Freeman listened to Clara's account with an expression she would never forget. A mixture of grief for a wound 11 years old and cautious, fragile hope that perhaps, after all this time, the truth might finally matter to someone with the means to make it known. He agreed to bring what remained of his community's own memory and testimony forward, joining Clara's effort not as a stranger seeking a favor, but as a rightful claimant seeking, at long last, the justice the law had promised them and quietly failed to deliver. The newspaper editor, Buford Lang, published the first article in the spring of 1890, laying out the certified land records. The Surveyor's Journal and the letters bearing Harlan Pruitt's own signature in careful, factual language that left no room for the railroad company to dismiss it as mere rumor or grievance. The story spread quickly beyond the county, picked up by larger papers eager for a tale of corporate corruption and quiet frontier justice. And within weeks, the Federal Land Commissioner's office, faced with certified records, an original surveyor's account, and a wronged community ready to testify, opened a formal inquiry into the Freedom Crossing land claims. Harlan Pruitt did not face a courtroom drama of the kind found in dime novels. No dramatic confrontation with pistols or midnight confessions. Instead, he faced something slower and, in its own way, more thorough. The federal inquiry, drawing on the certified records Clara had provided, confirmed without meaningful dispute that the original Freedom Crossing homestead claims had been legally valid, and that the technicalities used to invalidate them 11 years earlier had been manufactured through improper influence over regional land officials, several of whom, facing their own scrutiny, corroborated the scheme in exchange for leniency. The Continental Overland Rail Company, eager to avoid a scandal that threatened its standing with federal regulators and its access to further land grants elsewhere, quietly forced Harlan Pruitt's resignation from his position in the company's board. In a carefully worded public statement, distanced itself from his individual actions while agreeing, under pressure from the Land Commissioner's office, to restore clear title to the Freedom Crossing lands wherever the original families or their descendants could be identified and located, was not a perfect justice. Some families, scattered too far and too long, were never fully traced, and Harlan Pruitt himself, though disgraced and stripped of his position and his standing in banking circles, faced no criminal charge for what he had done, since the statute governing such land fraud carried, in that era, only civil remedy rather than criminal penalty. He retired quietly to a distant city, his name mentioned thereafter only in hushed, disapproving tones among those who once respected him, a man who had traded his reputation and his conscience for limestone and quiet influence, and lost both in the end. For the families who could be found, however, the restoration meant everything. Amos Freeman and a dozen other families received clear Title II portions of their original land. And though 11 years of lost labor and lost home could never fully be returned to them, they returned to Freedom Crossing that same year, rebuilding modest homes on ground that was, at long last, legally and rightfully theirs again. Clara Whitfield did not ask for, nor did she receive, any portion of the limestone royalties or land value at stake, though the Federal Land Commissioner's office, recognizing her role in uncovering the fraud, arranged a modest finder stipend, along with formal recognition, naming her the rightful owner of the boxcar and its now famous hidden contents. A small irony that brought a tired smile to her face when the papers were read to her. With that stipend, modest as it was, Clara did something that surprised the entire town of Miller's Bend. Rather than use the money simply to secure her own comfort, she used it to purchase, at a fair and honest price, a small parcel of land at the center of town, and she began, with the help of Elias Cobb and a handful of others who had stood by her through the long fight, to restore the old grain depot building that had stood empty since the railroad's rerouting 11 years before. She turned it, over the following year, into a modest general store and community hall. The first new business, Miller's Bend, had seen since the town's decline began, employing 3 local families and giving the town, for the first time in over a decade, a reason to believe its story was not yet finished. The old boxcar itself, the very hull she had purchased for $5 desperate, was moved into town at Clara's request and set beside the new community hall, its rotted boards repaired, its rusted iron fittings cleaned and oiled, transformed at last into a small museum room where the certified land records, a copy of Josiah Reed's journal, and the story of Freedom Crossing's restoration were kept on permanent, honest display for anyone in Miller's Bend or beyond who cared to remember. Amos Freeman and several families from Freedom Crossing traveled to Miller's Bend for the dedication of that small museum room, and it was Amos himself who suggested the plaque mounted above the boxcar's repaired door, reading simply that value once discarded and forgotten had been restored not through wealth or power, but through one woman's patient refusal to believe that anything or anyone was truly beyond redemption. Clara Whitfield, standing before that small crowd on a clear spring afternoon, thought often, in the months that followed, of the $5 she had paid for a rusted railroad car that everyone else in Miller's Bend had considered worthless. She thought of her mother's old wedding dress, transformed into christening gowns for families who could never have afforded new cloth, and of her father's discarded wagon wheels, planed and fitted until they rolled true again. She thought, too, of Josiah Reed, a careful and honest surveyor whose name had nearly vanished from history entirely, remembered now at last in the very town he had quietly tried to protect. The lesson, Clara often said in the years that followed, whenever a neighbor or a visitor asked her about the boxcar that sat proudly beside the Miller's Bend Community Hall, was not really about railroad cars at all. It was that the world was full of things and people that others had already decided to write off, to call worthless, to leave abandoned on some forgotten siding of life, when in truth they were only waiting patiently in the dark for someone willing to look closely enough to see what still remained. She had lost a business built over 26 years to men who valued only what could be measured in profit and paper. She had, in turn, restored a community's home and a good man's forgotten memory by valuing what others had already discarded. And in doing so, she had found something in her own life restored as well. A purpose, a place, and a quiet dignity that no contract, however cleverly written, could ever take from her again. We want to thank you sincerely for staying with us through Clara Whitfield's story, and for the forgotten place that became, against every expectation, a doorway to justice long overdue. If her story moved you, we hope you will share it with someone who might need reminding that value often hides where others have long since stopped looking. We would love to hear from you as well, so let us leave you with one question to carry with you. What is a time you found value in something others had already written off? Till next time, stay close.